Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Honestly, it's great to be back diving into this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Because, I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine being completely isolated. You're in your own private garden, and you are suddenly cornered by the two most powerful, most respected judges in your entire city.
Right, the guys who literally run the justice system.
Exactly. And they tell you if you scream for help, they have already decided to use their unquestioned authority to frame you for a capital crime. The community is definitely going to believe them, and you will be executed.
It's just a terrifying scenario.
It really is, because your only other option is to stay silent, submit to their demands, and basically lose your soul and everything you stand for. Well, now, this isn't the plot of some modern psychological thriller, and it's not a leaked #MeToo story from, a corporate boardroom. It is a 2,000-year-old courtroom drama.
Yeah, and it is arguably one of the most intense, sophisticated pieces of ancient storytelling we have. I mean, it completely shatters that stereotype that ancient texts are just, dry lists of genealogies or super obscure rituals.
Oh, for sure. So we are doing a deep dive into the Apocryphal book of Susanna today. And just for anyone who needs a really quick refresher, the Apocrypha refers to those ancient Jewish texts that were widely read in antiquity, but they ultimately didn't make the final cut of the official Hebrew Bible.
Right. They kind of sit in this really fascinating historical and theological twilight zone.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to basically act as your guides through this specific narrative. We want to pull out the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-life application embedded in here. Because, the struggles Susanna faces, the weaponization of authority, blackmail, fighting for truth in a total echo chamber, it is almost uncomfortably relevant to you and me right now.
Oh, the relevance is staggering, really, once you strip away the ancient setting. The author of this text was grappling with systemic corruption, the failure of justice systems, and just how vulnerable innocent people actually are.
And to really get how they tackle those massive themes, we have to look at how meticulously this trap is set up.
Exactly. So the story drops us right into Babylon during the Jewish exile.
Right. So the Jewish people have been deported from Jerusalem. They're living as this minority community inside a massive empire.
Right. And we are introduced to our main character, Susanna. The text describes her as deeply devout. She was raised by righteous parents who grounded her heavily in the law of Moses. And she's married to this guy named Joachim, who is incredibly wealthy and just highly respected in the community.
And he has this massive, beautiful garden attached to his estate, right?
He does, yeah. And that estate actually becomes the focal point of the whole community. Because Joachim is so prominent, all the legal, social, and civic affairs are practically run out of his living room. It's basically an unofficial courthouse for the exiled Jews.
Which is such a double-edged sword, if you think about it. It means community leadership is constantly walking through his front door. And unchecked power mixed with extreme privacy is just a really dangerous combination.
It's a recipe for disaster. And that is exactly how we meet our antagonists.
Yeah, the two elders.
Right. The text tells us that two elders of the people had been appointed as judges that specific year. These are guys at the absolute pinnacle of religious and civic authority. People come to them with their disputes, and they just trust their rulings implicitly.
But these two men end up sharing this really dark, growing obsession.
Yeah, super creepy. Every day, as the community packs up and leaves at noon, the estate gets quiet, right? And Susanna has this habit of walking alone in her husband's garden.
Just getting some peace and quiet.
Exactly. But the elders are watching her day after day. They observe this routine, and they become utterly consumed by lust.
What really strikes me about the start of this conspiracy is the psychological realism of it. They don't just instantly form a villainous pact and twirl their mustaches.
No, not at all. They're actually hiding it from each other at first.
Because they're ashamed, right? They are supposed to be the moral pillars of the community, and here they are, harboring these incredibly illicit thoughts.
Yeah, they both pretend to go home for lunch, but then they both sneak back to the garden separately. They literally bump into each other, and the truth just spills out.
And that's the turning point.
It really is. The moment they realize they share the exact same intent, all that shame evaporates. The isolation of their individual guilt gets replaced by the validation of this shared conspiracy. So they agree to just wait for the perfect moment to corner her.
Which brings us to the trap. That moment arrives on a stiflingly hot day. Susanna decides to bathe in her garden. She sends her 2 maids away to go get oil and soap, and she specifically instructs them to shut and lock the garden doors.
Right. She assumes she is in complete, total privacy, entirely secure inside her own home.
But she's not. The elders had anticipated this. They had already smuggled themselves inside and were hiding in the bushes. It's just chilling. And the trap springs the second those maids leave. The elders rush her, and they present this absolutely horrifying ultimatum.
They corner her.
Yeah. They say, the doors are shut, no one can see us, and we want you. Consent to us and sleep with us.
And if she refuses, the blackmail drops.
Exactly. They say, if you say no, we will publicly testify against you. We will tell the whole community we saw you send your maids away because you're secretly meeting some young man here in the garden.
I mean, it is just a masterclass in the architecture of blackmail. Susanna is backed into a corner by men who hold literally every conceivable advantage. They have the institutional power, they have the societal trust, and they completely control the narrative.
They hold all the cards. If she screams, they are the judges. I mean, who on earth is the community going to believe?
Exactly. And this really brings us to the core wisdom of this first section. Susanna's response here is just this profound statement of moral clarity. She realizes the absolute finality of her situation.
She says, I'm straightened on every side. Yeah. She calculates the reality. Under the law of Moses, the penalty for adultery is death. If she submits to them, she dies spiritually. And let's be honest, they'd probably still betray her and have her executed just to cover their tracks anyway.
Oh, 100%.
But if she refuses, they'll frame her, and she will certainly be executed by the state. She is literally squeezed between losing her life and losing her soul.
And the text is insisting here that true integrity isn't forged when things are easy. It's forged right here. In the squeeze.
Yeah.
It's forged in these terrifying moments where doing the right thing offers absolutely no earthly reward. In fact, it guarantees your personal ruin.
But, let's be realistic for a second. It is super easy for us to sit in a studio and praise her integrity. Susanna literally chose a death sentence over moral compromise. Isn't that standard just kind of impossible for the average person today?
Well, it is an extreme standard, sure. But the extreme life or death stakes are basically a literary device. It's designed to clarify a universal principle. The author is forcing you, the reader, to ask where your ultimate allegiance really lies.
Okay, that makes sense.
When we translate this ancient garden into 21st century realities, the elders of our time aren't usually threatening us with literal stoning, but the mechanics of the trap, they are identical.
Oh, absolutely. Today's elders are like toxic workplace cultures or corrupt institutional boards.
Or abusive relationships.
Right. It's the powerful executive who casually asks you to falsify a compliance report and implies that if you don't play ball, your career is finished. Or it's a community leader who uses their untouchable status to demand silence about their misconduct and threatens you with social exile if you speak up.
And the genius of Susanna's response is that her decision was actually made long before those elders stepped out of the bushes.
Her internal moral framework was already set.
Exactly. Deeply rooted. When the crisis hit, she didn't have to scramble and weigh the pros and cons of situational ethics. She just knew instantly that preserving her integrity before God was way more important than preserving her reputation before a totally corrupt society. She says, "It is better for me to fall into your hands and not do it than to sin in the sight of the Lord."
That is so powerful. And the text also gives us this brilliant diagnosis of how these powerful men justified their actions. Because they aren't written as atheists.
No.
They literally sit in the seat of religious power, but they seem to operate under this very specific psychological blind spot.
Right, and you're referring to the linguistic choice in the original Greek sources here, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, break that down for us.
So the text says the elders perverted their own mind and turned away their eyes that they might not look unto heaven nor remember just judgments. It deliberately uses the Greek word oranos, meaning heaven, as a reverent substitution for God. And throughout the narrative, Susanna's gaze is constantly described as looking upward toward heaven. She is acutely aware of a higher reality. But the elders, they deliberately turn their eyes downward.
So it's basically practical atheism.
Precisely. I mean, they have the titles, they've memorized the scriptures, they issue legal rulings all day long. But in the private moments of their lives, they live as if the sky is empty.
Like no one higher is watching them.
Exactly. They operate as if there is no accountability. The psychological insight here is that gross injustice by people in power doesn't usually start with some grand philosophical rejection of faith or ethics. It starts with a deliberate turning away of the eyes.
Wow.
It's that conscious choice to compartmentalize, to just ignore accountability in the exact moment of temptation.
That is so true. So faced with this impossible choice, Susanna screams. She chooses her integrity over her safety. And the elders immediately start shouting to cover their tracks.
They have to move fast.
Right. They unlock the doors, the servants rush in, and the elders spin this completely fabricated story about some mysterious young man who fought them off and escaped.
And the servants are just shocked. I mean, Susanna's reputation has always been completely spotless.
But the trap is set, and the very next morning, we witness the terrifying reality of what happens in an echo chamber of authority.
Yeah, the morning assembly, Joachim's house, is truly chilling. The two elders arrive, entirely committed to their perjury. They order Susanna to be brought out, and she enters, surrounded by her parents, her children, her entire household.
This is totally humiliating.
Completely. The elders stand up right in the middle of the crowd. They place their hands on her head, which, by the way, was the formal legal requirement for witnesses laying a capital charge in ancient Jewish law.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's very procedural. And they just confidently deliver their lie to the community.
And the reaction of the crowd is honestly the most disturbing part of the entire text. I mean, there is no investigation. There's no search party formed to go find this supposed young man. There's no questioning of the timeline or looking for physical evidence.
Nothing.
The text simply states, "Then the assembly believed them, as those that were the elders of the people and judges, so they condemned her to death."
They just swallow it whole.
They outsource their critical thinking entirely to the status of the accusers.
And to really understand why the crowd behaves this way and why the author emphasizes this blind trust so much, we have to look at the world this text was actually written in.
Let's get into the history.
Because this narrative isn't just like an isolated moral fable. It is a fierce, highly political piece of protest literature. It's directed at a very real, very corrupt justice system.
Right, because the story is set in Babylon during the exile, but that's just the fictional stage, right? Where are we really in history when this is written?
What's fascinating here is that scholars overwhelmingly agree this text was birthed during a period of massive political and religious upheaval in Judea. We're talking specifically about the later years of the reign of King Alexander Janus.
Okay, and when is that?
Roughly between 95 and 80 BC.
So Alexander Janus, he was a ruler from the Hasmonean dynasty, right? The descendants of the Maccabees. And his reign was pretty notoriously brutal.
Brutal is an understatement. It was an era entirely defined by a bloody civil war between two major factions, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Janus was both the king and the high priest, which is a lot of power, and he fiercely aligned himself with the Sadducees.
And at this time, the Sadducees were basically the aristocratic elite.
Yes, they controlled the temple, they controlled the wealth, and crucially for our story, they controlled the law courts, including the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Legal Council.
Let's actually define those factions a bit more clearly, just for anyone not super steeped in first century Jewish politics. The Sadducees were the literalists, right?
Yeah.
Like, they only accepted the written Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and they just rejected anything outside of it.
Yeah, that's spot on. They were the conservative aristocracy. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were the populists. They believed in the oral law, the traditions of the fathers, which eventually became the Mishnah.
Okay.
They believed the law needed to be actively interpreted and adapted to actually protect the people. So they were highly focused on rigorous legal defense and kind of the democratization of religion.
And Alexander Jannaeus just despised them.
He hated them.
There is this specific horrific historical event that really illustrates the tension between Jannaeus and the Pharisees, the incident at the Feast of Tabernacle.
Oh, yeah, it perfectly captures how explosive the environment was.
Yeah.
So in 95 BC, Jannaeus is officiating as the high priest during the Feast of Tabernacles.
Yeah.
And there's this key ritual that involved pouring a ceremonial water libation on the altar. Now, the Pharisees taught a very specific oral tradition on how this must be done. Jannaeus, just to deliberately mock their teachings, pours the water out at his own feet instead of on the altar.
Oh, wow. He basically used a highly sacred ritual to give a massive political middle finger to the populist movement.
Exactly.
And the crowd, who heavily supported the Pharisees, I'm guessing they did not take that well.
They rioted. The worshippers were carrying festive branches and citrons, you know, a type of citrus fruit used in the celebration. They literally started pelting the king priest with their fruit.
Wait, They threw fruit at him?
Yes. But Janaeus' response was apocalyptic. He called in his foreign mercenary troops, and they slaughtered 6,000 Jewish worshippers right there in the temple courtyards.
Good grief. That's just staggering violence over fruit and a water ritual.
And that sparked a 6-year civil war. Janaeus eventually crushed the Pharisaic rebellion. And at the end of it, just to send a message, he had 800 Pharisee leaders crucified in the center of Jerusalem in a single day. And while they were dying on the crosses, he had their wives and children slaughtered right before their eyes. He actually threw a banquet for his concubines and sat there watching the executions.
That is horrific, but that is the dark, traumatic soil from which the book of Susanna grows. The Pharisees are this deeply oppressed group, and the Sadducees are wielding state and judicial power like a weapon.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a specific Pharisee leader, Simon ben Shattak. His personal tragedy almost directly mirrors the Susanna story.
Yes, Simon ben Shattak was a brilliant Pharisaic legal scholar. He was trying to survive and reform the system during this whole nightmare period, and the Sadducees, using their control of the courts, decided to target him.
But they don't attack him directly, do they?
No, they're sneakier than that. They produced false informers who brought a capital charge, likely treason, or some severe religious violation against Simon's own son.
So they framed the son of their political rival just to destroy his family.
Yeah, and here is where the legal philosophy of the Sadducees actually became a weapon. See, Sadducean courts at that time relied heavily on the prestige of witnesses. They didn't rigorously cross-examine authoritative individuals.
They just believed them because they were important.
Exactly. They essentially took verified elite testimony at face value. And because of this fatal procedural flaw, Simon's son was condemned to death.
But wait, the false witnesses eventually crack, don't they?
They do. On the way to the execution, the perjurers actually broke down. The guilt completely overwhelmed them, and they confessed to the crowd that they had fabricated the entire story.
Okay, so the son is exonerated, the execution is halted, and he goes free, right?
No. And this is where the history just completely breaks your heart.
Oh, no.
The son refused to accept a reprieve.
Wait, really? Why?
Because under the strict legal codes of the Sadducees at the time, once a verdict was handed down based on witness testimony, it was incredibly difficult to overturn without a completely new trial process, which he knew the corrupt courts would never grant fairly. So the son looked at his father, Simon ben Shattak, and he said, "If thou desirest that help should come through thee, use me as a threshold."
Use me as a threshold.
Yes.
He is telling his father to step over his dead body to achieve justice.
He chose to go through with his own wrongful execution so that his death would serve as this undeniable, bloody monument exposing the absolute corruption of the Sadducean legal system.
That is just, wow.
He knew that if he walked free on a technicality, the corrupt witnesses would just slink away unpunished, the procedural flaws would remain exactly the same, and the system would just target someone else the next week. He literally martyred himself to force legal reform.
That is immense. And when we lay that history over the text of Susanna, the courtroom scene completely transforms. I mean, we aren't just reading a fable about an innocent woman anymore. We are reading Pharisaic protest literature.
Exactly.
It is a searing critique of a justice system where truth doesn't even matter and where the elite just protect the elite.
Yeah, and Simon ben Shattak famously taught this core legal principle. He said, "Make full examination of the witnesses, but be guarded in thy words, perchance from them they may learn to lie." The story of Susanna was essentially written to champion this exact philosophy. It's a desperate warning about the deadly danger of the echo chamber of authority.
And translating that for us today, I mean, it is impossible not to see our own media landscapes, our own corporate structures, our own community dynamics reflected right there in that Babylonian courtyard.
Oh, for sure.
How often do you, as a listener, instantly believe a narrative just because it comes from someone with a verified checkmark on social media, or someone with a prestigious academic title, or a prominent pulpit? We see a headline or we hear some community gossip from a quote-unquote trusted source, and we just immediately condemn whoever is targeted without asking a single critical question.
It's a cognitive shortcut. We outsource our critical thinking because, honestly, it's just easier to trust the person with status, than it is to do the incredibly hard, messy work of investigating the truth. But this ancient text is warning us that when a community adopts that shortcut, innocent people get crushed in the gears of the machine.
So the practical challenge for you listening right now is immediate. When you are consuming news or when you are handed a highly charged narrative about someone in your workplace, you have to actively train yourself to pause. You must separate the status of the speaker from the actual evidence of their claim.
Exactly.
You have to ask yourself, am I believing this because it is demonstrably, objectively true? Or am I believing this just because I assume a person in this position wouldn't lie?
Because the terrifying reality the author wants us to grasp is that sometimes the people who seem the most upright, the ones wearing the robes of authority, are the ones hiding the deepest, most destructive corruption.
And Susanna is condemned by this blind trust. She cries out to God, she asserts her absolute innocence, but she is physically bound and led away to the execution grounds. The system has worked exactly as the elders designed it, but just as the trap is about to close permanently, a disruptor enters the scene.
Yes. The text says that God raised up the Holy Spirit of a young youth whose name was Daniel. Now, in some of the oldest versions of this text, it seems it was just an anonymous young man.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the author was likely contrasting the corrupt, entrenched old age of the elders with the inspired, uncorrupted sincerity of youth. But in the version that became famous and canonical for many, it's Daniel, the famous prophet. And Daniel doesn't just ask a polite question from the back. He stops the entire procession. He shouts, "I am clear from the blood of this woman."
He just aggressively challenges the crowd. He calls them fools. He says, "Are ye such fools, ye sons of Israel, that without examination or knowledge of the truth, ye have condemned a daughter of Israel?" And he demands they return to the place of judgment.
And here we see the brilliant implementation of Simon ben Shattak's legal philosophy. Daniel doesn't just stand up and offer a competing character witness for Susanna. He targets the structural, procedural flaw in the trial itself.
Right, the lack of cross-examination.
Exactly. He says, "Put them asunder, one far from another, and I will examine them." He completely isolates the two elders.
It's like trying to perfectly forge painting.
Right.
Two amateur forgers can agree on the main image. Like, okay, we're painting a landscape with a red barn. And if you ask them together what they painted, they both say a red barn.
Right.
But if you separate them and you ask them for the exact hex code of the red paint used on the barn door, the forgery just falls apart. One says crimson, the other says maroon. Daniel isn't looking at the broad picture they painted for the crowd. He's looking for the paint codes.
That is the perfect analogy. It is the foundational principle of modern police interrogation and cross-examination. If witnesses are lying, they have rehearsed the main plot, but they almost never rehearse the minute peripheral details. By separating them, Daniel guarantees the conspired narrative will fracture.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because Daniel calls the first elder forward. He rebukes him severely. He accuses him of a lifetime of corrupt judgments, of condemning the innocent and letting the guilty go free. And then he asks the trap question, "Under what tree sawest thou them companying together?"
And this is where the text gets incredibly fascinating for language historians and scholars, because the elder answers, and Daniel's response contains this massive smoking gun that actually sparked a huge debate in the early Christian church.
The famous Greek tree puns, let's break this down because it is brilliant.
It really is. So in the Greek text, the first elder answers that he saw the affair happen under a mastic tree. The mastic is a Mediterranean tree. It produces a resin used in antiquity for chewing gum.
Okay.
And in Greek, the word for mastic tree is skinos. Daniel immediately fires back. "Right well hast thou lied against thine own head, for even now the angel of God hath received the sentence of God and shall cut thee in two." The Greek word for cut or cleave is sisai. So skinos and sisai. It's a biting, deliberate pun.
That's amazing. So then Daniel dismisses him and brings in the second elder. And he hasn't heard a single word of the previous exchange. Daniel rebukes him, calls him a descendant of Canaan, basically implying his behavior is entirely pagan, and asks the exact same question. And the second elder, having to guess, chooses a completely different tree.
Naturally.
He says, "Under a holm tree, a holm oak is a large evergreen oak." In Greek, that's prinos.
And Daniel replies, "The angel of God waiteth with the sword to cut thee in two." And the Greek verb he uses there is kataprise, prinos and kataprise.
So the contradiction is just undeniable at this point. The lie is exposed instantly, and the crowd just erupts in vindication for Susanna. But going back to those linguistic puns for a second, this wordplay is so hyper-specific to the Greek language.
Very much so.
Does this mean the story of Susanna was originally written in Greek rather than Hebrew or Aramaic like the rest of the Old Testament?
Well, this exact question caused a major scholarly clash in the 3rd century. Julius Africanus, who was a Roman military officer turned Christian historian, he wrote a very critical letter to Origen. And Origen was arguably the greatest theologian and textual scholar in Alexandria at the time. Africanus pointed to these exact puns as definitive proof that the story was a later Greek fiction.
Which, I mean, his argument makes intuitive sense. It's like trying to translate a knock-knock joke from English to Mandarin. It almost always falls flat because the humor relies on the phonetic sounds of specific words, not just their definitions.
Exactly.
So Africanus was saying you can't translate a pun from Hebrew to Greek and have it magically perfectly match two specific Greek trees and two specific Greek verbs.
That was exactly his point. Africanus argued that the Book of Susanna should not be considered scripture because it was clearly forged in Greek. But Origen wrote this massive response defending the text. Origen actually went out and consulted leading Jewish scholars of his day. Yeah. He asked them if there were Hebrew or Aramaic tree names that sounded phonetically similar to the Hebrew words for cutting or splitting. He was desperately trying to find a Hebrew original that justified the translation.
Did he find one? Like, what is the modern consensus on this?
So the modern consensus, which is supported by scholars like Kay from our source material, is that the original text was almost certainly Hebrew or Aramaic.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. The Greek text we have is absolutely saturated with Semitic idioms and Hebrew sentence structures. For instance, starting 50 consecutive sentences with the word and.
Right.
That is a very common, beautiful style in biblical Hebrew. But it is terrible, clunky style in conversational Greek. A native Greek author writing a fiction wouldn't write like that.
So how on earth do we explain the perfect Greek puns if the original was Hebrew?
Scholars suggest that the ancient Jewish translators who created the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, were just incredibly creative, dynamic translators. Instead of woodenly, literally transliterating a Hebrew tree name that a Greek audience wouldn't even understand, the translator grasped the literary function of the moment. He realized Daniel was actively mocking the elders with wordplay. So the translator found Greek trees and Greek verbs that achieved the exact same rhetorical punch for a Greek-speaking audience. It was a brilliant cultural adaptation.
That is so cool. It just shows how alive this text was to the communities that were preserving it. But pulling us back to the narrative, Daniel catches them. The systemic blind spot of the community, which is accepting authority without evidence, is cured by a single individual demanding specific, corroborating details.
Which presents a profound challenge to us. The text is literally daring you to become a Daniel in your own sphere of influence.
Yeah. When you find yourself in a situation where a unified, overwhelming narrative is forming that threatens to destroy someone's character, maybe it's a whisper campaign in your office, or a massive pile-on social media, do you have the internal fortitude to stand in the middle of the crowd and ask for the trees?
That's the question.
Do you have the courage to say, hold on, I know this accuser has a fancy title, I know everyone else is nodding along, but what are the specific, provable details here? Because their story doesn't add up. True wisdom isn't just knowing the rules of your community, it's having the courage to halt the execution when the process is visibly flawed.
But holding the execution of Susanna leads directly to the execution of the elders. And this brings us to a section of the text that is deeply jarring to modern sensibilities. We cannot extract the wisdom without confronting the obstacles to growth and the really uncomfortable realities attached to this ancient narrative.
Yeah, we have to deal with the brutality here, because on a narrative level, Daniel's triumph is incredibly satisfying, sure. The corrupt villains are caught in their own trap. But the mechanics of the trial, the laws governing it, and the way the punishment is carried out are horrific by modern standards. If we try to read this as a literal blueprint for a modern legal system, we run into major ethical walls.
Let's examine that brutality. First off, the penalty for adultery that Susanna was facing was death by stoning. This is drawn straight from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But beyond the capital punishment, there was the deeply disturbing way the elders treat her during the trial itself. The text explicitly notes these wicked men commanded her to be unveiled, for she was veiled, that they might be filled with her beauty.
It is a nauseating abuse of power. They are publicly humiliating her, subjecting her to intense vulnerability while simultaneously satisfying their own lust under this protective guise of legal procedure.
And what's crucial to understand is that they were perverting an actual religious law to do it. The Mishnah, the Jewish oral tradition, contained very specific regulations for dealing with a wife suspected of adultery, derived from the Book of Numbers. These were known as the Soda rules.
What did those rules actually entail originally?
Well, the original concept involved a priest uncovering the hair of the accused woman to shame her as part of the trial. But the later rabbis, men like Rabbi Judah, recognized how easily this could be abused by corrupt men.
I mean, obviously.
Yeah. So they instituted strict limitations within the Mishnah. Rabbi Judah explicitly taught that if the woman's bosom was beautiful, it should not be revealed, and if her hair was beautiful, it should not be loosened. The rabbis were trying to build fences to protect the dignity of the accused from voyeuristic abuse.
So these elders, they knew the law, they knew the rabbinic protections, and they just threw out the limitations, weaponizing the religious procedure purely for their own perverse gratification. It is a terrifying historical picture of how religious and legal systems can be manipulated by those in power to justify abuse.
Exactly. And then we reach the resolution of the story. Daniel exposes the perjury, and the text says, according to the law of Moses, they did unto them in such sort as they maliciously intended to do to their neighbor, and they put them to death. And some ancient versions are even more graphic, describing the elders being gagged, hurled into a deep chasm, and destroyed by fire from heaven.
It is the ultimate expression of ius talionis, right? The law of retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Because they intended to have Susanna stoned, they are executed instead. And this connects right back to the debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees you mentioned earlier.
Yes. This ending is the theological and political punchline of the entire book. It hinges on the interpretation of Deuteronomy 19:19, which says, regarding a false witness, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother.
Okay.
Now, the Sadducees argued a strictly literalist, sequential view of this verse. They argued you only execute the false witness if the victim has already been executed.
I'm trying to picture the logic there. You're saying the Sadducees would execute someone for perjury only if the innocent victim had already died? That seems completely backwards and just useless for actually protecting the innocent.
It was incredibly flawed, which is exactly why Simon ben Shetek's son had to go through with his execution. He died so that the Sadducean court would be legally forced by their own literalist interpretation to execute his false accusers. If he had been rescued, the false witnesses would have lived.
But the Pharisees completely rejected that.
The Pharisees argued that the intent to slay by false witness was enough to merit the death penalty, regardless of whether the victim survived or not. The book of Susanna is basically a Pharisaic manifesto proving this point. Susanna is saved, she does not die, but the elders are executed anyway, purely because of what they intended to do.
Okay, I hear that historical context, and I understand why it was revolutionary for them at the time, but let's be critical for a moment. As modern readers, isn't it kind of dangerous to celebrate this eye for an eye justice today?
It's a fair question.
I mean, we live in a society that values rehabilitation, due process, and proportionate justice over literal, bloody retaliation. If we are supposed to be pulling practical wisdom from this text, are we honestly supposed to endorse throwing corrupt judges into a chasm?
It's a vital distinction to make, and this is where we practice wisdom with discernment. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are absolutely not called to adopt the ancient judicial system of Judea. We can wholly reject the patriarchal assumptions of the era. You know, the idea that Susanna needed a male rescuer like Daniel to be believed by her community, or that state-sanctioned execution is the ideal resolution for perjury. We don't have to adopt their brutal blueprint for criminal justice to appreciate the core message.
So what is the enduring truth we do carry forward then? If we strip away the stoning and the chasms, what actually remains?
What remains is the demand for the moral rebalancing of the scales. The text is screaming that abusers of power must be held accountable. It argues that the punishment for perjury, for weaponizing a legal or social system to destroy an innocent life, must be severe enough to actually deter untouchable elites from doing it.
Right.
It's about the absolute sanctity of truth in public life.
Yeah.
Those elders believed their titles made them above the law. The story asserts that no one, no matter how high their religious or civic rank, is above the truth.
I see the distinction. We leave the ancient brutality in the past, but we adopt the absolute intolerance for the abuse of power. We embrace the idea that intent matters and that systems must be built to protect the vulnerable from the powerful.
Exactly.
And that universal resonance is likely why this story had such an incredible, enduring legacy. Which brings us to our final exploration: how this ancient Jewish legal thriller survived to influence global culture.
The journey of this text through history is almost as dramatic as the courtroom scene itself. Despite its brilliance, it was ultimately excluded from the official Jewish canon, a decision largely championed by influential leaders like Rabbi Akiba around 90 AD, after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Why did they exclude it? Was it just because it made the highest levels of Jewish leadership look incredibly corrupt and terrible?
That was a significant part of the hesitation, yeah. The rabbis who fixed the canon were trying to rebuild Judaism after a catastrophic war with Rome. They were not eager to canonize a book that explicitly highlighted internal corruption, the probity of judges, and the vulnerability of the daughters of Israel to their own leaders.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, because it reflected an older Pharisaic versus Sadducean debate that was no longer the primary issue after the temple fell, it just wasn't viewed as useful for establishing ongoing legal precedent. So it was pushed to the Apocrypha.
But the irony is that while the synagogue distanced itself from the story, the early Christian church fiercely embraced it. They just read it entirely differently.
It did. While Jewish scholars saw a troubling domestic scandal and a debate over witness laws, the early Christians read it as profound spiritual allegory. Hippolytus, who was a prominent theologian and eventually the Bishop of Rome around 230 AD, wrote a massive, incredibly detailed commentary on the Book of Susanna. He allegorized the entire narrative.
How did he map it out? Like, who was who?
He argued that Susanna prefigured the persecuted Christian church, standing pure but vulnerable. Her husband, Joachim, represented Christ. Babylon was the sinful, oppressive world the church was exiled in. The garden was the sanctuary of the faithful. And the two corrupt elders represented the corrupt powers of the world, both pagan empires and religious persecutors, plotting to destroy the church through false accusations.
It's amazing how a text shifts its meaning based on the anxieties of the people reading it. A political tract demanding Jewish court reform transforms into a mystical allegory for the survival of a persecuted religious minority. And its influence didn't even stop at theology. It actually bled over into secular Roman law.
It absolutely did. The central plea of the text, the absolute necessity of cross-examining informers and punishing perjury, that colored the arguments of early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr when they were defending Christians before Roman magistrates.
Wow.
And you see echoes of the Susanna principle in the actual legal rescripts of Roman emperors. Emperor Antoninus Pius in the 2nd century issued a ruling stating that if someone informed against a Christian purely out of malice and without evidence, the Christian should be discharged and the informer himself should undergo the punishment intended for the accused.
That is the exact Pharisaic principle of Deuteronomy 19.19 playing out in imperial Roman law.
Exactly.
Not to mention the impact the story had on centuries of art. If you walk into any major museum in the world, from the catacombs of Rome to the masterworks of the Renaissance, you will find artists who painted Susanna and the elders. Rembrandt painted it. Artemisia Gentileschi painted an incredibly powerful, harrowing version of it that deeply highlights the terror and the #MeToo aspect of the assault drawn from her own experiences.
It's a staggering cultural footprint.
It really is. But this raises an important question. Out of all the thousands of ancient texts, scrolls, and fables that have been lost to the sands of time, why did this specific story survive? Why did it resonate so deeply across Jewish, Christian, and secular cultures for 2 millennia?
I think it survived because it touches on something primal. The archetype of the innocent, isolated victim facing down a corrupt, unified system of power is a universal human nightmare. We all possess a deep-seated fear of being misunderstood, of being framed, of being crushed by people who have more power, more money, and more influence than we do. Susanna represents that ultimate, terrifying vulnerability.
And Daniel represents our universal hope. He is the embodiment of the hope that someone will see through the lies, the hope that the truth actually have a voice, and that justice isn't entirely blind, or at least that the blindfold can be removed if someone is just brave enough to ask the right questions.
It's a narrative that looks the darkest parts of human corruption right in the eye, and tells us that while the abuse of power is a reality, it is not omnipotent. The truth has a specific texture. It has a specific shape, like the profound difference between a mastic tree and a holm oak. And if you are patient enough and brave enough to look for those details, the lies will eventually tear themselves apart under their own weight.
That is a profound place to land, and it brings this ancient text right to the doorstep of your own life today. Think about the gardens in your own world, those private spaces, your workplace, your community, your intimate relationships. Where are you making your choices? Are you cultivating the kind of internal fortitude, that pre-decided moral clarity that can withstand the elders of our day when the squeeze comes?
Because it will come.
Exactly. And on the flip side, when the crowd around you is rushing to judgment, when the echo chamber is loud and demanding a cancellation or a rapid condemnation, will you be the one who pauses? Will you be the one who asks for the evidence? Will you be the one to ask for the trees? True wisdom isn't just knowing the rules of your society, it's having the courage to halt the execution when the truth is missing. That's the heart of the section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.